the way the Western world has treated Ukraine is sort of like a check engine light in their car that they just choose to ignore, because for them it is not causing an immediate problem. But if you let a check engine light go on and on and on and on, because maybe you just don't want to experience the cost now of fixing whatever problem there is in your engine, what will ultimately happen is that that problem can create a much more severe problem, and what was a minor problem could actually cause a catastrophic engine failure. What we are doing with Ukraine in the Western world is, to a large degree, although this has been changed recently, there's still work to do, to a large degree, we are trying to shove the problem under the rug and push it off until tomorrow. But what I would really like to remind everybody is that someday tomorrow comes. And someday those costs will have to be paid. In my videos, I talk a lot about the fact that Russia is destroying itself because of its war against Ukraine. And it's destroying itself on multiple levels. It's destroying itself economically, militarily, culturally, sociologically, and in so many other ways. And I also talk a lot about how the war in Ukraine is a war of attrition, where I actually think Ukraine has the advantage over the long term if the war in Ukraine continues for a long period of time, and how for several reasons Ukraine can actually defeat Russia by simply outlasting them on the battlefield and holding their defensive positions until Russia has completely exhausted itself. And these points are all true, and these are points that I will vehemently hold to no matter what anybody says, because I have seen the facts and the data behind all of them and have very strong, logically constructed arguments to defend each of those points. However, because of this, a lot of people get a certain misconception, which is that the war in Ukraine does not have to be ended quickly, but rather the war in Ukraine can kind of just be put aside and the world can just wait for Russia to ultimately defeat itself. And while I do think that is probably a likely outcome if the world does indeed choose to wait, I want to address in this video why that should not be the attitude anybody has towards Ukraine, in particular policymakers. By giving a sense of urgency to why the world actually needs to end the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible, but not end it through wishful thinking, through a peace deal that just gives Russia everything they want, but actually needs to win it in an appropriate way that will lead to a Ukrainian victory. So obviously in a discussion like this, what needs to be stated at the forefront that a lot of policymakers simply seem to be neglecting is the fact that every day the war in Ukraine goes on, more lives are lost that did not need to be lost. And this is true not just on the Ukrainian side, but it's also true on the Russian side. And it's also true not just in terms of lives lost, but lives destroyed and upended by the war, which encompasses not just Ukrainians and Russians, but also people in this entire region of the world who depend on regional stability to carry out their lives as they normally would, and who are just sort of in a holding pattern waiting for this to be resolved. But obviously, while I have to say that, this is the point that everybody seems to already know or should know, and so it's the point that I will spend the least time on, not because it's the least important, but because I want to bring to mind a lot of other issues that people just simply seem to be forgetting about, which is beyond the human cost and beyond the human toll. There are risks involved with every day that the war in Ukraine continues to rage. First and foremost, the longer that we sit on our hands and just sort of wait for the war in Ukraine to resolve itself, the more likely it is for an outcome to happen that is not what we actually want. Most Western countries and most Western politicians will say that the outcome they want is for Ukraine to ultimately emerge victorious over Russia, or at least not to be completely defeated by Russia. And currently, I think that outcome is by far the most likely outcome, perhaps a 7 or 8 out of 10. But despite that, that is not a foregone conclusion. And many things in this war can change with time, particularly when it comes to technological development. where there is a real chance that the longer we wait, the longer Russia has time to get more entrenched with different partners that it has around the globe. And it can use those partnerships to focus on developing technology that could give it an edge over Ukraine. Currently, I don't think that's happening. It seems like Ukraine is winning the technology war, but all warfare is secretive. And it could very well be that, like the Germans were developing many weapons in World War II to try to overcome their opponents overwhelmingly, Russia could be working on such weapons that they might be willing to use. Weapons that are beyond nuclear weapons, which are not practical weapons that Russia ever seems likely to actually use, but rather weapons that have to do with drone technology and AI. Which brings me to my second point of why the world needs to work really hard to bring about the outcome it wants in Ukraine as quickly as it possibly can. What a lot of people aren't thinking carefully enough about is how the war in Ukraine is a definitive moment in human history when it comes to military technology. And we really haven't seen anything this definitive since World War II. And as we know, when World War II ended, the outcome of that war was nuclear weapons, which led to many decades of human conflict that defined the way the entire globe operated for many decades. And really, the result of World War II was many decades of people living in fear of nuclear annihilation. And something similar could happen if the world allows the war in Ukraine to fester for too long. What I'm talking about is how, as a result of the war in Ukraine, in both Ukraine and Russia is being developed AI-powered technology that is creating weapons that, when they reach a competent level, will probably be the most terrifying weapons that humanity has ever developed, notwithstanding nukes, but these weapons will be more likely to actually be used because they can be used at a smaller scale and therefore don't invite such large-scale retaliation. And in fact, you can use an AI weapon with nobody actually knowing who it was that actually used the weapon. And these weapons, as I said, are being developed by both Ukraine and Russia, and are really only being able to be developed at the scale and the pace they're being developed because of the data that is coming from the active battlefield, where we have AI-powered drones already that are getting more and more advanced because of all of the drone data that comes from combat experience with hundreds and thousands of drones on the battlefield every single day. This data has already allowed drones to advance many scales faster than they would in, for example, a laboratory or a simulated environment. And the longer the war continues, the more fearsome these weapons are going to get. And so the faster the war is ended, though these weapons at this point are likely inevitable, the more time it buys humanity to think through these problems and to come up with solutions. And if you want to learn more about this, I have an entire video on this topic of AI-powered drones and how the war in Ukraine is really impacting the future of global warfare in ways that a lot of people have not even considered. Now, another reason the war in Ukraine needs to be concluded appropriately as soon as possible is because of what the ultimate outcome of the war will be, regardless of who wins on this entire region, and how much worse that outcome gets the longer the war progresses. Where in both countries, Ukraine and Russia, the longer the war progresses and the more resources that are spent on it and the more that is lost to it, the opportunities for chaos and anarchy get higher and higher and higher and higher. And this is far more pronounced in Russia than it is in Ukraine. And in fact, we are already seeing signs of this happening in Russia, where Russia could soon be in a state of uncontrolled collapse. And from the standpoint that that could end the war in Ukraine, that could be seen as a good thing, and to a certain extent it is. But what the world really needs is a controlled collapse of the Putin regime, and for it to be replaced by a Russian regime that is not so evil and not so intent on invading its neighbors. An uncontrolled collapse of Russia, which is getting more and more likely as Russia doubles down on the war and extends the extent of its casualties in terms of economy and people and all sorts of things, makes it more likely that Russia could descend into a state of anarchy. And we are already seeing signs of that, where in many parts of Russia, the Russian government has lost its ability to provide an adequate police force, and vigilante groups are stepping in to take up the mantle where the Russian government has failed, similar to what has happened in regions of South America and Central America and Africa, which have descended into chaos. Now, a lot of people, again, will see this as a good outcome, but when we think about what's going to happen in the regions around Russia, including Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, including Central Asia, and also just including Asia proper, and really including the rest of the world, which will be impacted if a country of over 100 million people descends into a state of severe collapse, we realize that those problems, if they can be avoided, they should be avoided. And that while we want Russia to lose the war, we probably don't want this outcome. Now, when it comes to regional stability, what we also have to think about is how the implications of the war in Ukraine can extend into other conflicts. Where the longer the war in Ukraine goes on and the more resources that get sucked up there and the more attention gets sucked up there, the more that China has time to build up its military capabilities to potentially make a move in Taiwan or even other parts of Southeast Asia. And even if we don't believe that is the most likely scenario, it still becomes more possible and more likely the longer that attention is distracted elsewhere. And for that reason, too, from a regional perspective, the world should want to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible to prevent other problems from emerging in its place. In this sense, the longer the war in Ukraine goes on, the more uncontrollable the situation in Russia is. And that becomes worse, not just for Russia itself, but also for the Western world and the rest of the world as a whole. And while those problems cannot be completely avoided at this point, the die is already cast, it's already too late. To the extent that they can be avoided, you would think that every politician would want to try to avoid them. Now, there are, of course, many other reasons for why the war in Ukraine must be ended as soon as possible, but hopefully with these three strong reasons I've provided something that will appeal to whatever kind of person happens to be watching this video. There's, of course, the humanitarian reason, which is probably the most important and the most obvious. But there's also the risk factor and where the world can go the longer the war in Ukraine continues, which plays itself out not just in terms of new technology, but also in terms of regional stability. And we already know how regional stability isn't truly just a regional problem, but it impacts the entire world. So all these reasons being stated, what can actually be done to end the war in Ukraine faster? Is this actually possible in a reasonable way with a good, reasonable outcome? Or is this just a pipe dream? Well, first and foremost, one outcome that should be discarded very quickly is just giving Russia everything they want so that we can avoid these other worst case scenarios. Not only because that is a terrible idea for so many reasons, but because at this point that has already been tried and Russia did not even accept it. Russia has shown that they really want to continue their war. And that means that because they are on the war path, even if they are given everything they want, and they do accept that, they are not likely to just sit still forever. They're more than likely to rebuild and continue on the war path, which means that giving Russia what they want will not resolve any of the issues that have been discussed in this video. It will just kick the can down the road and ultimately make those issues magnitudes worse in the long term. So with that in mind, the logical place we have to turn is that if giving Russia everything they want is not a reasonable solution or a reasonable outcome, if it doesn't solve any of the problems, the only other logical outcome is to help Ukraine defeat Russia more quickly. And a lot of people see this as a terribly difficult objective, but it actually does not have to be as difficult as most people make it seem. When you start talking about ending the war in Ukraine more quickly, a lot of people's minds immediately jump to sending in Western troops to support Ukraine and using those Western troops to help overcome Russia. And I'm not actually saying I'm completely opposed to that idea, but I also know that from a practical standpoint, with all that's going on in Western governments right now, that is not likely to go over very well at this point, even if at some point in the future, just like in World War I and World War II, governments will be forced to do that, even though they've tried to resist it for a long time. With that being said, there are a lot of steps that governments can take before getting to that level, and if they really want to avoid getting to that level, they should probably actively pursue those steps. And the most obvious step that can be given is simply to give Ukraine more support. And not just support that will help defend Ukraine, although that is incredibly important, but Ukraine needs to be given support that will actually help them to actively win the war faster, which means support for Ukraine to actively attack strategic targets within Russia instead of just waiting to destroy targets once they enter Ukraine. The most critical partners here are obviously the United States and Europe in that order, who possess the technology to hit these strategic targets within Russia and end the war far more quickly. And this technology does not even actually have to be given to Ukraine. It simply needs to be sold to Ukraine, or in many cases, Ukraine already has it. They just don't have permission to use it as is needed. And so if Ukraine was given permission to actually hit production facilities in Russia, which they could definitely do, facilities that are producing drones or even researching drones, creating one of the problems I mentioned earlier in this video, that would actively reduce Russia's ability to fight on the battlefield and would very quickly accelerate Russia's ultimate demise. Because as it is, Russia cannot provide enough materiel on the battlefield to overcome what Ukraine has. And so if Ukraine was able to take larger scale strikes against larger scale targets on a much more frequent basis, that would actively very significantly reduce the length of the war. But it's not just military targets that could be hit within Russia. It's also, of course, economic targets that could reduce Russia's ability to fund the war and to continue funding their economy. So we look at things like oil refineries, which Ukraine has largely stopped striking to the degree that they were earlier, or just oil targets in general. I think probably because of Western pressure on them to not do this, and Ukraine has stopped doing that in exchange for other kinds of Western support. But obviously, it would be a better scenario if Ukraine did not have to choose between those two things. If people weren't being stubborn with Ukraine and trying to kind of get what they want, but instead looked at the macro environment of what this war is and where this war could lead, and made the decision to just give them what they needed to end the war more quickly instead of trying to get whatever it is they want out of it. This doesn't just all have to involve weapons, though. It can also include monetary or humanitarian support for people who are more opposed to providing things like weapons. Although I would argue the outcome of providing weapons is, at the end of the day, achieving the same goal of the humanitarian or the monetary support when you're providing them to a country like Ukraine that's defending themselves and that is not an aggressor. But at the same time, support does not have to involve weapons, especially from countries that can't provide weapons. Support can also be given to Ukraine to whatever degrees countries can give it to continue supporting their economy, to take the pressure off Ukraine financially so they can continue focusing on what they do best. And actually, what Ukraine does best, if they are given adequate funding, is to a large degree weapons production. They can't meet all of their weapons production needs and categories. They can't provide certain categories of weapons for themselves, but in the categories they can certainly ramp up production volumes if they are given sufficient funding. And this funding does not have to come, as it turns out, from people's own pockets, because there is a significant treasure trove that could be given to Ukraine that has been sitting there for years that will not cost any Western governments anything. And that is frozen Russian assets that were frozen on purpose because it was identified that these assets belong to people who got their money from doing the types of things that have led to this type of war that we're seeing now. These frozen assets could be deployed to help Ukraine end the war more quickly. And I understand that a lot of politicians are nervous about doing that because they are worried about the outcomes of doing that and how Russia will respond and if they will ever want to do business in their countries again in the future. But they're not thinking logically. They're not thinking about the fact that the rift between Russia and the West is already there, and it will be there probably for at least half a generation, if not a full generation. And they're also not weighing those risks against the risks of allowing the war in Ukraine to continue longer than it has to, because we're just drip feeding Ukraine support instead of giving them what they need to end the war quickly and to win the war quickly. The point I'm making in this video is that the way the Western world has treated Ukraine is sort of like a check engine light in their car that they just choose to ignore, because for them it is not causing an immediate problem. But if you let a check engine light go on and on and on and on, because maybe you just don't want to experience the cost now of fixing whatever problem there is in your engine, what will ultimately happen is that that problem can create a much more severe problem, and what was a minor problem could actually cause a catastrophic engine failure. What we are doing with Ukraine in the Western world is, to a large degree, although this has been changed recently, there's still work to do, to a large degree, we are trying to shove the problem under the rug and push it off until tomorrow. But what I would really like to remind everybody is that someday tomorrow comes. And someday those costs will have to be paid. What the world really needs right now is leaders who aren't thinking about how people are going to react today or what problems it's going to create for them today. But the world needs leaders who are long-term strategic thinkers, who think through cause and effect, who understand where things can lead, and who take active steps to solve those problems. And that's not just true in one country. I live in the United States. It's true to a large degree in my country, but it's true in every country in the world. Now, I've shared a lot of thoughts in this video about not only why the war in Ukraine must be ended quickly, but also some practical steps that can be taken to actually achieve that goal. But I know these thoughts are not comprehensive, and a lot of people will view this video. So please go to the comments and let me know more reasons why the world is at risk the longer we let the war in Ukraine carry on. And also, submit your creative thinking to how the world can solve this problem faster. A lot of people watch these videos. A lot of important people watch these videos, more than you might think. And we can have an impact by sharing this information together and collectively using our brains to solve the biggest challenge our world faces at this current moment. That being said, thanks so much for watching, and thanks to everybody who supports this channel and helps make these videos possible, whether that be through Patreon, or Buy Me a Coffee, or as a YouTube channel member, or in any other way. Be sure to check out these videos on screen, and I'll see you on the next one.